This video we're going to talk a little bit about the champion Magnus Carlsen, his history. We're going to go through some of the games where he's played white against Ian Nepomniachtchi in the past year or two. And we're going to talk a little bit about match strategy and what I think Magnus should play as the white pieces and what I think Ian should play with the black pieces. Alright, so let's start a little bit about talking about the history of Magnus Carlsen. He was born in 1990, he's 30 years old, and at age 13 he became a grandmaster. And by age 18 he had already crossed over 2,800, which was a huge achievement. And we haven't seen that since currently Alireza Firouzja. By age 19, Magnus was world number 1, highest rating in the world, and he's held that title for the last 19 years, with a small exception where Anand was slightly higher right after Magnus became world number 1. And then fast forward 3 years later, age 22, Magnus played Anand in a world championship match, and Magnus was able to beat Anand pretty handily 6.5 to 3.5. So at age 22, we already see a world champion Magnus. And keep in mind, he's 30 years old now. So he's been champion for 8 years, and he's held the world number 1 for 11 years, starting at age 19. At age 25, he defended his title against Sergei Karyakin. They tied 6-6 in the classical games, and Magnus won the tiebreaker 3-1. And at age 27, 2 years later, he played Fabiano Caruana, and Caruana was on a really hot streak. They had very similar classical ratings. They also tied 6-6, and in the tiebreaker, Magnus was able to win that one 3-0. Fast forward to current time, age 30, now Magnus has a match against Ian Nepomniachtchi, and the interesting thing with this match is Ian has a 4-1 lead in their previous classical games. So in today's video, I'm going to go over Magnus from the white side, and talk a little about the match strategy from the white side. In tomorrow's video, I'm going to go over Ian Nepomniachtchi's highlights and looking at him from the white side and match strategy. And then 2 days from this video, I'm going to look at some of the head-to-head classical games. So stay tuned for that one if you want to see just their classical games. So now let's talk a little bit about the match history between Magnus and Ian, going all the way back to February of 2020. So this was kind of the start of online chess becoming more popular. There was the start of the pandemic, and all of these top players began playing online. So when these players first met in this Chess24 event called the Legends of Chess, they played a few suspect openings, kind of like blitz openings, things that they would maybe play for fun, not realizing how serious online chess was about to become. So we see a couple openings, like in this one, there's a modern defense by Ian, and Magnus was able to actually outplay Ian in this endgame, queen and 3 pawns against queen, bishop, and pawn, and get the win. So we're going to go through some of these games and talk about how they won and so on. This was kind of closer to the end position. This is the very end. Magnus got the win. Now in the next game, we see that they played a London system. So Magnus with the white pieces played the London. This is not a typical system for Magnus. And out of the London system, it was actually a very smooth win by Magnus against the fianchetto defense. So this was sort of the end of the game. The engine's evaluating this at +7. Very nice conversion by Magnus after knight to d5. This position is completely falling apart, and the black queen is kind of getting trapped at the same time. Moving on to the next game from the same event, Legends of Chess. This was a modern defense. So another modern defense by Ian. Magnus won the first one by outplaying him in the endgame. This one, Magnus was pressing throughout the whole game. We ended up getting to a draw, but at some points in the game, Magnus had a 2 or 3 point advantage according to the engine. It ended up in this drawn rook and pawn endgame. So then the next event they played in was the St. Louis Blitz chess event, which was played on Lichess. It was actually Blitz and Rapid. In this Rapid game, Magnus played the English, and we'll see this in both of the St. Louis games. In this one, Magnus actually lost, and it was kind of a back and forth game, so there was a lot of tactics, and eventually with the dynamics, Jan was able to outplay Magnus in the endgame and get the win. In this one, I'm actually wondering if it was on time, because in the very end position, the engine's saying Magnus actually had a 0.7 advantage, but Jan did get the win. And then the next game they played at the same event, St. Louis Blitz on Lichess. This was another English with e5 by Jan. And in this one, Magnus had endgame winning chances. So if we fast forward to the endgame, this is actually an advantage for Magnus, rook against knight, 2 pawns against 3 pawns, but Jan was able to hold the draw at the very end in this position. So through the first 5 games that we've looked at, I would say 4 of them went well for Magnus. 2 in the Modern, 1 in the London, and 1 in the English. Only 1 game really went well for Jan. That was the English game, the first one where it was kind of back and forth. Now, if we fast forward to the next event, the Skilling Open, this was on Chess24 back in November of last year. In my opinion, this is where the players started to really bring their A games in terms of bringing their best opening systems and leaving it all on the line, trying to win the events. And a lot of these events had huge prize funds, so I think the players realized that they weren't going to be playing over the board, so it's okay to bring your best openings to these online events and really fight for these top prizes. So in this game, we see d4 by Magnus, knight f6 by Jan, and after c4, Jan plays his most popular weapon against e4, the Grunfeld. And this game is very interesting because I think this is kind of the start of the players feeling each other out on what types of systems will work against each other. And this was actually a very easy win for Magnus in an exchange Grunfeld. So I'll just kind of fast forward through these moves and take a look at how smooth this felt for Magnus. He castles queenside, gets some play on the dark squares, and after d6, this position is already lost according to Stockfish. Lost for Jan, I should say. White is winning. That knight can't go anywhere. And eventually Magnus wins the knight and moves on to win the game with this idea of checkmating the black king with the help of the 2 rooks. So first Grunfeld we see, it's an exchange Grunfeld, easy win for Magnus. Now the next game is actually in the same event, so this is also a Chess24 game. This is not a classical event, not over the board. And we see another Grunfeld exchange line. So I think Magnus really wanted to test this main weapon of Jan and see what would happen. Jan came prepared this time, and we actually had a draw, but Jan was holding the lead most of the time and had a very large advantage in the middle game. Around this point, Stockfish is saying it's a 2 or 3 point advantage for Jan. So we had 1 easy win for Magnus in the exchange Grunfeld, but now we see that Jan learned from that game, actually had a large advantage middle game, and Magnus was lucky to escape with a draw. So what happens in the next game? Is Magnus going to go back for the Grunfeld? He starts with 1 e4, and Jan's main defense against e4 is the Sicilian, so he's playing his main weapon here. After e4, c5, Magnus tends to play knight f3. So in this game he plays to c3, and I'm not sure if he was trying to, hide his own preparation, or if he just wanted to see what Jan would play, or just was feeling like doing something offbeat. But he plays the c3 Sicilian, and in this game Magnus outplayed Jan in the endgame. So they were even all the way up until about this point, and Magnus was able to outplay Jan in the endgame. So I wouldn't say this was an opening win. This was a win that Magnus had to really work for, and it took some tactics in the endgame. Around this point, it started to go in Magnus's favor. The next game, also in the Skilling Open, we see e4 again by Magnus. All right, so we saw 2 Grunfelds, one went well, one went poorly for Magnus, I would say, even though he escaped with the draw. Then he wins with the c3 Sicilian, and now we see Magnus play 2 knight f3 against the Sicilian, and he goes for the Moscow. And Magnus actually missed a win at the end of this game, so this one also went well for Magnus. This is 1e4. So if we think of all the games we've looked at so far, we've seen 2 with e4, both of them went well for Magnus. And it's the most recent 2 games that we've looked at. This was kind of a look at the middle game, and here's the end game, where Magnus did have an advantage. Bishop pair, better pawn structure. Stockfish is saying about +2, but Jan was able to hold a draw in the end, right around this position. So then the next game, this is the Carlsen Invitational Knockout on Chess24. This was a rapid event online. And in this one, we had an exchange Grunfeld. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong game. So this one we had d4, knight f6, c4, e6. This is the second most common system for Jan after the Grunfeld. So when d4 is played, Jan tends to play Grunfeld. When he doesn't play Grunfeld, he'll play e6 and d5, go for kind of a Queen's Gambit decline setup. And every so often he'll play the Queen's Gambit accepted, as we'll see. Now this is interesting because we've seen 2 Grunfelds recently. One went well for Magnus, the easy win, but one was the draw where Jan had the advantage. So what's going to happen when we shift gears and go into Queen's Gambit territory? We see a Queen's Gambit accepted by Jan, and Jan was actually able to hold an equal game all the way to the endgame. Magnus had some good winning chances in a queen and pawn endgame. Stockfish actually said there was a couple wins there that Magnus missed, and Jan was able to hold the draw with a bunch of checks at the very end. So I would say still a good opening choice by Magnus, but at the same time Jan was able to hold that even position long throughout the middle game, so maybe Magnus should still consider e4 versus d4, because we've seen good results with e4 so far by Magnus. Then the next game, also from the Carlsen Invitational, this is another Queen's Gambit accepted, and in this one there was a really strong attack by Jan. So the middle game was pretty even, but if you look at the position, there's a lot of imbalances in Jan Castle's queen side, and he was actually able to build this huge attack and crush Magnus. And this is one of the better games by Jan, I think. So now we've seen a draw in the Queen's Gambit accepted and a loss for Magnus in the Queen's Gambit accepted, where Jan had a really strong attack. So start kind of keeping tally in your mind of these Queen's Gambit games. Now let's go to the next game. This is also the Carlsen Invitational. And in this game, we actually see a Queen's Gambit exchange variation. So Carlsen doesn't let him take on c4. He goes for the exchange variation. And the interesting thing with this game is Magnus had a slight lead in the middle game, but when they reached the end game, Jan actually outplayed Magnus to win in the end game. And this was a really nice endgame by Jan. This white king is in huge trouble, -7, according to Stockfish, and Carlsen resigned the game. Next game, also from the Carlsen Invitational. This was a 1e4 by Magnus. So it's possible there that Magnus got a little bit tired of the Queen's Gambit. We saw they played 3 games in the Carlsen Invitational so far. One was a draw, Queen's Gambit accepted, and then there was a loss in the Queen's Gambit accepted and a loss in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. So Magnus scored half a point out of 3 in the Queen's Gambit lines. Now he goes back to e4, and we see the main weapon by Jan, a Sicilian Najdorf, And Magnus has one of the smoothest wins he has against Jan in all of these games that I looked at. This was just straight stockfish eval going up the whole way. Really smooth win. And I think this is a sign of what we should expect coming up, and we'll get a little more into that after we review the last couple games. Now we'll move to the last game from the Carlsen Invitational. And this one, Magnus went back to d4, and we see another exchange. Queen's Gambit declined. And Magnus again had a slight advantage in the middle game, according to Stockfish. And this is actually probably already the endgame. But what happens here is Jan outplays Magnus again in the endgame, and we reach this position where Jan actually is winning with this passed b pawn. And here Magnus blunders the queen, but it is already a loss. So we see Magnus winning with the Sicilian Najdorf, going back to the Queen's Gambit, and losing again in the Queen's Gambit. So d4 is not going well for Magnus recently. All right, now we have two more games to look at. These are the last two. This is from Norway Chess. It's a classical game, and we will be going over this one in the video in 2 days. But Magnus played e4, and I think this could be a sign of what to expect. And we see e5 by Jan. Now, Jan's main weapon is the Sicilian. He plays it probably 2/3 of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time. And the remaining 1/3, maybe 1/4, is the French defense for the most part. It's pretty rare to see Jan play e5 in recent times. So it's interesting that they play for a Berlin, and Magnus doesn't really get much out of it. This is sort of a dry Berlin. The eval stays very close to equal. But the thing I don't know is I don't know how hard Magnus was playing for the win here. I don't know if he necessarily was bringing his best stuff against the Berlin. Maybe he was a little surprised to see the Berlin. But he really wasn't able to get any advantage at all. And eventually the players agreed to a draw in this rook and pawn endgame. And then the last game that they played was also at Norway Chess, but this was a blitz game. And this was an Armageddon game, so a little bit different than your standard blitz game, just meaning Armageddon, Magnus actually has to win with white. And he starts with knight f3. We reached a Fien-Ketto Grunfeld, where Magnus plays b3. And Magnus was able to play for the win in this game. And this was a pretty smooth game by Magnus, but I don't want to put a lot of weight into this game because it's Armageddon and it's blitz. It's just a bit different than the online rapid games and definitely different than the over-the-board classical games. All right, so that's the summary of the recent games where Magnus has the white pieces. Now let's talk a little bit about the strategy and the stats. So what I did was I pulled all the games from these players from 2020 and 2021, including online games. So this does bring in rapid and blitz, but it's going to give us a sense of how well the players do in these openings. With the white pieces, Magnus does better with 1e4 against Jan. But what is he going to do against the Berlin defense, I think is the big question. And in the stats, since 2020, Magnus underperforms his rating when he plays 1e4 by about 4 points. And if you're used to looking at opening stats and looking at the performance ELO against actual ELO ratings, usually you want to outperform your rating by about 35 points on average when you have the white pieces. When you have the black pieces, you might expect to underperform your rating by about 35 points. So it's very interesting that Magnus is not able to outperform his rating when he plays e4 overall. And Magnus scores much better with 1d4 and 1c4. Those are the top two scoring options for Magnus. You'll also see him sometimes play 1 knight f3 to mix things up a little bit, like he did in this last Armageddon game. Now, looking at Jan's stats, Jan does the best against 1d4, and he has two very solid weapons. He has the Queen's Gambit, and he has the Grunfeld. So he has the Grunfeld when he wants to play aggressive, and he has the Queen's Gambit when he wants to play solid. And he's very strong at both of those. And against 1e4, typically Jan plays the Sicilian, like we talked about, with the French defense as his backup. Now, from a match strategy point of view, I think Magnus wants to win with the white pieces, and he wants to get Jan to play dynamic systems. Now, if Magnus plays 1d4, I don't think he's going to want to face Jan's Queen's Gambit declined, Queen's Gambit accepted combo with a chance of maybe walking into some deep Grunfeld preparation. So I really think Magnus should stick to 1e4 to start this match and see what Jan plays. And what Magnus can do is have a really good system ready for the Sicilian Najdorf. He can definitely get prepped for that. He's got a strong team working with him. And there's a lot of places that maybe black could go wrong in a Najdorf. And Jan's a fast player. He likes to move quickly. Maybe he'll fall into a trap right out of the opening. I don't think the French defense is really playable at the World Championship level because Magnus will probably have something ready and you just don't really see the French at this high of a level. I think Magnus would be able to get a good advantage against it. So then the other thing that Magnus would have to look out for is the Berlin. So after 1e4, e5, Magnus would need to figure out, what do I want to play in this position? I'm guessing knight f3, but here he might either play some sort of anti-Berlin with d3, or maybe he would play the Gioco Piano, bishop c3 or bishop c4. But I think he's going to want to have something ready in these lines as a backup. And if Jan comes really prepared for the Berlin, maybe Magnus does want to switch to the English or one knight f3, but I think he really should start e4 and get a feel for what Jan wants to play, kind of hoping for the Sicilian, being ready for the French, and definitely being ready for 1e5. And for Jan's perspective, I think he should come prepared against 1e4 and have e5 ready. Obviously, he needs to prep for everything, but I think maybe a Berlin defense again would be good against Magnus because Magnus definitely wasn't having fun in their Berlin defense game, or at least he wasn't playing for any advantage. And when I look at the stats with Magnus playing against the Berlin, he really doesn't perform that well. So he tends to just mix up all the different move orders, meaning he keeps the opponent on their toes, but he doesn't have like one really sound system against e5. So I think for Magnus, start out with 1e4. Let's see what Jan does. And for Jan, when he's playing the black pieces, I really think you should come prepared with the Berlin and just try to kill the game. Go for boring drawish lines. Even though the fans might not like it, you'll hopefully get Magnus to go into one of the d4 type openings. And I think that's where Jan has the best chance to maybe even score some upsets from the black side. All right, so let me know what you think in the comments. What do you think Magnus should play as white? What do you think Jan should play as black? And then tomorrow's video, we're going to look at the reverse side. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.